I want to be honest about something before I get into any of this. When the Galactic Integration Bureau contacted me, and I mean contacted me directly, through an encrypted channel that hijacked my laptop, my phone, and somehow also the smart speaker my sister had given me for Christmas, my first reaction wasn't excitement. It wasn't wonder. It wasn't the kind of trembling all you see in movies where humanity makes first contact and everyone cries and holds each other and a choir starts playing. My first reaction was that someone was pulling a very elaborate prank. I was 29 years old. I worked in municipal water infrastructure planning for a mid-sized city in Ohio. I drove a car with a cracked bumper that I kept meaning to fix. I ate lunch at the same deli every Tuesday because they gave you an extra pickle if you asked nicely, and the guy behind the counter, whose name was Frank, had started just putting 2 pickles on my sandwich without me asking, because we'd arrived at that comfortable kind of familiarity that takes years to build with another human being. I was ordinary, deeply, completely, contentedly ordinary. So when the voice came through, not through any one device, but sort of through all of them at once, like the sound was being generated from inside the room rather than from speakers, and it said, in accented but clear English, that I had been selected as Earth's first civilian integration candidate for the Dralith Consortium, my immediate response was to unplug the smart speaker, flip my laptop closed, and sit very still for about 40 seconds. Then I said, out loud to no one, "Frank probably put something in the pickle." The voice came back, through the laptop this time, even though I'd closed it. "Elias Voss, we apologize for the intrusion. We have been monitoring human communications infrastructure for an appropriate liaison candidate. You were selected based on several criteria which we would be pleased to explain in person. A transport window opens in 11 of your hours. Do you consent to proceed?" I sat with that for a long time. I want to say I asked the right questions. I want to say I was smart about it, that I interrogated the voice with calm, systematic logic, that I treated it like a professional challenge and handled it with composure. What I actually said was, "Is this going to take more than a week? Because I have a budget review on Thursday." There was a pause on their end. It was the first time I'd made an alien pause. I didn't know it then, but it wouldn't be the last. "We can have you back within 6 of your days," the voice said. "The consortium values punctuality." I thought about Frank. I thought about my cracked bumper. I thought about the budget review, which I genuinely did not want to attend. "All right," I said, "fine, but I'm bringing snacks." The transport was nothing like the movies either. I'd expected a beam of light, a rush of wind, something dramatic, something that felt like the universe opening up. Instead, a door appeared in my hallway, not a portal or a shimmer or a tear in the fabric of space, but an actual door slightly shorter than standard, made of something that looked like brushed gunmetal with small blue-green lights running along its frame. It looked like the kind of door you'd find in an upscale commercial building. Understated. Professional. A figure stood beside it, bipedal, which I appreciated, about 5'8". Wearing what I can only describe as a uniform structured dark gray, with panels that shifted color slightly when the light hit them. No helmet. The face was humanoid enough that I didn't feel a physical startle, but the eyes were different, amber, very bright, with pupils that were slightly more vertical than horizontal. The skin had a faint blue-gray undertone, like someone seen through very clean glass. "Elias Voss," the figure said, male voice. "Young, maybe, hard to tell. I am Coordinator Tail. I will be your escort to Dralith Station. Please step through." "Is it safe?" I asked. "Statistically," Tail said, "it is among the safest forms of transportation in the consortium." "That's not a yes." Another pause. "Yes," he said after a moment. "It is safe." I picked up my bag. I'd packed it the way you'd pack for a work trip, because that's how I decided to think about this, as a slightly unusual work trip, and I walked through. The transit itself took about 4 seconds of subjective time. I don't have good language for what those 4 seconds felt like, so I'm not going to try. What I'll say is that when I came out the other side, I was standing in a docking bay that was approximately the size of a football stadium, and the ceiling was so far above me that the lights up there looked like stars, and the air smelled like ozone and something faintly sweet that I later learned was the natural atmospheric additive they used to prevent headaches in species with oxygen-based biology. There were beings everywhere. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because it's the single most accurate description I can offer. Every direction I looked, there was something alive and moving and not human. Tall, spindly creatures with 4 arms. Squat, broad things that moved on 6 legs. Things that floated. Things that communicated in clicks I could feel in my back teeth. Things that looked almost human, until you noticed the wrong number of fingers, or the way their heads turned too far, or the way the light didn't quite reflect off them the way it should. I stood there, I breathed. Coordinator Sael appeared at my shoulder. "Are you experiencing distress?" "No," I said, which was mostly true, "just looking." "You have 6 seconds remaining of what we've designated your adjustment window. After that, the reception is scheduled to begin." "The reception?" "Yes," he said it like it was obvious. "You are the first human civilian to visit Dralith Station. There will be a formal welcome." I had not been told about a formal welcome. I was wearing a fleece jacket. The reception hall was called the Chamber of Concordance, which was the kind of name that would have sounded grandiose anywhere except inside Dralith Station, where everything was so large and so precisely constructed that grandeur just felt like a baseline condition. The room could have held several thousand beings comfortably. It held, at that moment, what I estimated to be around 400, arranged in loose clusters along the sides of a wide central walkway. Coordinator Sael walked ahead of me. I walked behind him. As we entered, something changed in the room: the ambient sound, the posture of the beings near the door, the angle of the lights. I couldn't name it precisely. It was the physical feeling of attention shifting. They were all looking at me. Let me be clear, I am not someone who enjoys being looked at. I give presentations at work sometimes, and I still get the same clenching, hollow discomfort in my chest that I've gotten since I had to read a poem aloud in 7th grade and stumbled over the word ephemeral so badly that my classmate Ricky Doherty started calling me Ephemeral Elias for the rest of the school year. Being the center of attention is not something I've spent my life pursuing. But this was different. Because the looks weren't ordinary looks. They were looks with weight. Every pair of eyes, and the range of what counted as eyes in that room was considerable, was tracking me with a quality of attention I can only describe as reverent. Like I was something they'd been told stories about and couldn't quite believe was real. I kept walking because stopping felt worse. A figure stepped forward as we reached the center of the room, taller than most of the beings there, wearing deep burgundy and gold, with a ceremonial quality to the garment that was clear even across species. This was not someone who came to be ignored. "Elias Voss of Saul III," the figure said, in a voice that carried without effort, "Welcome to Dralith Station. I am High Administrator Corval of the Dralith Consortium. On behalf of our 8-member species and our 42 associate members, I offer you formal greeting." The room made a sound, not applause, something different, a low, layered tone from many different vocal structures at once. It should have been strange. Instead, it felt warm. I had a second to decide how to respond, a bad second. I said, "Thank you. This is a really impressive room." There was a small, genuine stillness. Then High Administrator Corval did something I hadn't expected from someone of that bearing. He smiled, or what his facial structure produced that read as a smile, and said, "We hoped it would please you." After that, the reception moved. Beings came to me in small groups, introduced by Sael in rapid whispers that I immediately lost track of, and I shook hands or performed the nearest equivalent and smiled and nodded and asked questions when I remembered too. The food they offered me had been vetted for human biology, which I appreciated, even if most of it tasted like things I'd never eaten before. One thing tasted exactly like a slightly more savory version of movie theater popcorn. I ate 4 of them. It was during my 5th piece of space popcorn that I first saw her. She was standing near a pillar at the edge of the room, which is probably the most cliched location I could describe. But she was genuinely standing near a pillar at the edge of the room, so I'm going to be accurate rather than original. She was humanoid to a higher degree than most of the other beings present, which was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed was that she was the only one not looking at me. Everyone else's attention had settled on me like a slow, collective tide, but she was looking at the floor, or at the pillar, or at some middle distance point that had nothing to do with me. The third thing I noticed was that she was being deliberately not noticed. I don't know how to explain that better than that. It was the way someone stands when they're trying to take up no space. The way a person holds themselves when they're present but determined not to be seen. I recognized it because I've stood that way at a lot of work events, and you develop an eye for the posture. I mentioned her to Tail in a low voice. "Who's that, by the pillar?" He glanced over with a movement so careful it barely qualified as a glance. "Archivist Sael," he said. "She is a Velkari Station resident, a specialist in historical documentation." "She's not really blending in," I said, meaning. "She's the only person here who isn't trying to meet me." "The Velkari often prefer observation to direct interaction," Tail said, in the practiced tone of someone reciting a diplomatic explanation. "What's Velkari?" He hesitated a fraction of a second too long. "A designation for her species. They are long-lived, scholars primarily. They have been with the consortium since the early formation period." I would later learn that long-lived was a significant understatement, and that scholars was about as complete a description of the Velkari as calling a hawk a bird that likes to be outdoors. But in that moment I nodded, ate another piece of space popcorn, and let it go. The reception ended with another layered tone from the assembled beings, more words from High Administrator Corval about the historic significance of my presence, and a presentation of what Tail explained was a formal symbol of welcome, a small disc of engraved metal that was apparently considered an honor of considerable weight within the consortium. They walked me to my quarters. The room was generous, the bed was something close to comfortable, and the window looked out onto the station's interior atrium, which was lit in a way that cycled through color slowly, mimicking day cycles without pretending to be natural about it. I sat on the edge of the bed. I held the engraved disc. I thought something is off. I didn't know what. Everything had been impeccable. Every being had been gracious. The High Administrator had smiled. I'd been given space popcorn. But something was off. I put the disc down, lay back, and told myself I was being paranoid, that it was the stress of impossible circumstances doing what stress does. I'd been fine-tuned by 30 years of ordinary life to detect social wrongness, to feel the slight misalignment when people were performing rather than being, and probably that instinct was just firing on overdrive in a room full of alien social codes I had no framework to read. Probably. I fell asleep with the disc in my hand. Part 2. The treatment. Morning on Draelith Station is not a biological event, it's an administrative one. The light in my window shifted to a cooler, brighter register at what Tail had told me was 600 station time, and a soft tone came through a panel near the door. I got up, washed my face, put on the same fleece jacket because I hadn't brought a second one, a detail that felt increasingly significant in a setting this formal. Breakfast was already arranged on a surface near the window. I ate it carefully, identified the space popcorn equivalent. It was something round and slightly yielding, with a warm, slightly sweet taste, and ate 3 of them while looking out at the atrium. My schedule, Sael had explained, was organized for maximum familiarization. I would be given tour of the station's primary facilities. I would meet with department heads. I would be given meals specifically calibrated for human nutrition. I would be provided with translation modules that would improve over the course of my stay as the AI embedded in them processed my speech patterns. You are the first human civilian to stay for more than a transit period, Sael had told me. The consortium has prepared extensively. It showed. Everywhere I went, I was treated with a care that bordered on extraordinary. Not just courtesy, something more active than courtesy. Beings stepped aside. Spaces cleared. When I asked questions, the answers came with a thoroughness that suggested the questioners had anticipated my questions and prepared. When I expressed interest in something, the engineering of the station's atmospheric systems, the structure of the consortium's governance model, the way the atrium lighting was calibrated, the response wasn't just informative. It was enthusiastic, like my interest was a gift. It should have felt wonderful. Mostly it did. But the background hum of wrongness I'd noticed the night before didn't go away. On the second day, I noticed that certain corridors weren't on my tour. On the third day, I noticed that certain questions about the consortium's relationships with non-member species, about what happened to beings who violated integration protocols, about the history of the station's earliest years, were answered with a polished redirection that was so smooth I almost didn't notice it happening. Almost. On the fourth day, I sat in what they called the Heritage Hall, which was a vast display space chronicling the formation and expansion of the Dralith Consortium, and I spent about 2 hours looking at the exhibits while my assigned guide for the session, a pleasant being named Curator Ovesh, explained each one. And I noticed that the timeline had gaps. Not obvious ones, not the kind you'd see if someone had simply removed sections. More like the story the exhibits told had a consistent smoothness to it, a narrative coherence that felt slightly too complete. Real history is lumpy. It contradicts itself. It has periods that don't resolve cleanly and events that don't get explained well and figures who are mentioned once and never appear again. Real history, when someone tries to put it on display, always has the faint roughness of incompleteness. The Heritage Hall was smooth. I mentioned none of this to Curator Ovesh, or to Sael, or to anyone in an official capacity. Instead, I went back to my quarters that evening and wrote in the notebook I'd brought paper, ballpoint pen, zero connectivity, everything I'd noticed. It was a modest list, possibly meaningless. Probably the product of a mind that had spent too long in water infrastructure planning, where finding the gap in a system before the gap found you was something close to a professional value. But the list existed, I kept it. On the evening of the fourth day, she found me. I was in the atrium, which was accessible to station residents of all species, a commons area of sorts, sitting on a bench near a water feature that was clearly designed for beings who found the sound of water pleasant, which apparently included enough species that it was worth the infrastructure. I was writing in my notebook. The atrium was never completely empty, but at this hour it was relatively quiet, the foot traffic reduced to individuals rather than groups. I heard footsteps approach and stop. "You are Elias Voss," she said. I looked up. It was the girl from the pillar, Archivist Sael. Up close she was, I want to be precise here, because the way she looked is part of the story. She was pale in a way that wasn't unhealthy but wasn't incidental either, a paleness that suggested it was simply what her skin was, the same way a very dark piece of wood isn't stained but is itself. Her hair was a deep, dark color, almost blue-black, worn loose. She was tall, taller than me by a few inches, and her posture was the exact opposite of the careful disappearing act I'd noticed at the reception. She stood very straight. She stood like she meant to be standing right where she was. Her eyes were dark, almost entirely dark, with only a thin ring of deep red that I might not have noticed in worse lighting. They were looking at me with an assessment that was nothing like the reverence I'd gotten from everyone else in the station. She was looking at me the way someone looks at a problem they're deciding whether to solve. "Yes," I said. "I have 17 minutes before I'm expected to return to the archive," she said. "I want to use them to say something to you, and I need you to listen without reacting obviously, because I believe I'm being watched right now, and a conversation with you that ends with you alarmed is a conversation I'll be asked about." I closed my notebook. "All right," I said. "You've been treated very well," she said. She sat down on the bench beside me, not close but not far, and she looked out at the water feature rather than at me. "You've been given the best quarters on this level, the best food available for your biology. You've been shown the station's proudest spaces and introduced to its most impressive personnel." "Yes." "Yes," I said. "And in 4 days you haven't once been asked what you want," she said. "Not what you want to see, not what you want to learn, not what Earth might need from this relationship or what you personally are hoping to understand. You've been shown things, guided graciously through a curated experience." I said nothing, because she was right, and I'd been sitting with that observation without knowing how to name it. "The consortium needs something from you," she said. "Not from Earth, not from humans broadly. From you specifically, and from you while you are here on this station, during this particular cycle of the station calendar." "What do they need?" I said. She glanced at me then, just briefly. "You should not ask me that question right now," she said. "You should ask it in 3 places: the Heritage Hall, Section 4, Exhibit Cluster 9, the sublevels of the Atmospheric Processing Center, where the maintenance schedules have a 2-hour window beginning at 200 station time on the 6th day, and in the archive, which I will arrange access for." "That's not an answer," I said. "No," she said, "it's a map." She stood. "I have 11 minutes left. I need to walk away from you now, and I need you to look back at your notebook like I said something mildly interesting and nothing more." "What's your name?" I said. "Your full name." "Archivist Sael Vel Arenith," she said. "If you need to tell someone you spoke with me, use only Archivist Sael. The rest is mine." She walked away. She walked at the exact pace of someone who had accomplished what they came to do and was now simply going somewhere else. Nothing in her gait suggested urgency or secrecy. She walked like a person who understood that the most invisible thing you can do is look exactly like you're doing nothing important. I looked down at my notebook. My hand, I noticed, was very steady. I don't know what I expected, that I'd shake, that I'd feel the adrenaline spike that comes with danger. Instead, there was a kind of cold clarity. The hum I'd been feeling since I arrived had organized itself. It wasn't shapeless anymore. It was a warning. I wrote 3 things in my notebook. Section 4, Exhibit Cluster 9, Atmospheric Processing 200 Day 6, the archive. Then I wrote underneath, in small letters I'd have to squint to read later, "They plan to sacrifice you." I don't know why I wrote that. She hadn't said those words, but they appeared in my mind in the moment with a certainty that felt like memory, like something I'd already been told that I was only now registering. I looked out at the water feature. The water moved in exactly the way water moves when it has no current of its own, just the mechanically generated illusion of flow. Perfect, unnatural, beautiful. I sat with it for a long time. Part 3, What the Wall Didn't Show. The Heritage Hall at 200 station time looks nothing like it does during visiting hours. Let me be clear, I'm not someone who sneaks into places. I follow rules. I pay my parking tickets promptly. I have, on 2 separate occasions in my adult life, stopped to return money when I received incorrect change in my favor. I am a law-abiding person with an instinct for correct procedure that I developed early and have never significantly deviated from. I went to the Heritage Hall at 200 on the 5th day. The lights were on emergency setting, low and blue-tinged, the kind of light that makes everything look like the moment just before something happens. The exhibits were the same exhibits I'd seen during curator Ovesh's tour, but without him narrating and without the careful ambient lighting that made the colors richer and the displays more welcoming. They looked different, starker. Section 4 was at the back of the hall. The exhibits here covered a specific period that Ovesh had described as the early expansion era, the consortium's growth from its initial 3-member species to its current 8, standard organizational development, the kind of thing that sounds more interesting than it is. Exhibit Cluster 9, at the back of Section 4, was about something called the Concordat of Necessary Sacrifice. The signage was modest, clean lines, factual language. It described a period, approximately 200 standard years into the consortium's existence, during which the organization faced what it called a stability threshold, a point at which the collective could not sustain its growth without a significant infusion of what the text called binding resonance. I am not a xenosociologist. I am not a metaphysicist. I am a water infrastructure planner from Ohio. So let me tell you how the exhibit explained binding resonance in terms that I, a water infrastructure planner from Ohio, was able to understand. It was power. Specifically, it was the kind of power that different species' biological fields generated when they were in proximity, under specific conditions, during a specific astronomical alignment. The consortium had discovered, early in its existence, that certain rare biological signatures, ones that existed in only certain individuals of any given species, and very rarely in species not yet part of the consortium, acted as what the exhibit's text called a harmonic keystone, a living anchor for the field that held the consortium systems, from administrative to biological to what I could only interpret as metaphysical, in coherent alignment. The Concordat was the formal agreement among founding members about how to source and use these keystones. The word sacrifice appeared twice in the exhibit text. Both times, it was in context that suggested historical practice rather than current procedure. I stood in front of that exhibit for a long time. I thought about the word sacrifice. I thought about what Archivist Sael had implied without saying. I thought about the specific cycle of the station calendar she'd mentioned, and whether there was a way to find out what that cycle corresponded to in astronomical terms without asking anyone who was managing my experience here. Then I thought about something that had been in the Heritage Hall's first section, something curator Ovesh had mentioned in passing, quickly, the kind of mention that is designed to register as complete while actually providing no information. He'd said that Drelith Station was positioned at an intersection point, which he described as favorable for transit and communication. He'd said it with the same smooth ease as everything else, and I'd filed it away and moved on. An intersection point. I took out my notebook and wrote, keystone, harmonic anchor, specific alignment, intersection point, civilian, not diplomatic, not military, not institutional. Then I wrote, why a civilian? Why someone not attached to a framework that would notice if they didn't come back the same? I stayed in the Heritage Hall for another 40 minutes. I read every exhibit in Section 4. Some of it I couldn't fully parse. The translated language handled concepts in ways that felt slightly approximate, like looking at a thing through frosted glass. But the shape of it was clear enough. The consortium, at several points in its history, had needed a living biological keystone to stabilize what it called the resonant field, the invisible cohesive force that allowed vastly different species and technologies and biological systems to function together in a shared space. Finding and using that keystone had, in the early period, involved what the exhibit called consensual binding. But the notes at the edge of the exhibit, smaller text, secondary documentation that most visitors probably wouldn't pause to read, indicated that the consensual binding described in the main text was a revised protocol. The original protocol did not have a word for consent. I put my notebook away. I walked back to my quarters. I did not run. Running would have made me feel better and accomplished nothing. The atmospheric processing center at 200 on the 6th day was colder than the rest of the station, and smelled strongly of ozone, and the same faintly sweet additive I'd smelled everywhere but more concentrated here, where it was actually being produced and circulated. The maintenance window meant there were no workers in the sub-level access corridors. There was, however, Archivist Sael. She was wearing different clothes than she'd had at the reception, practical, dark, without the formal markers of her station function. She looked honestly like she'd dressed in the dark. I found it reassuring. "You came," she said. "You gave me a pretty compelling reason to," I said. She looked at me for a moment with that same assessing quality. Then she said, "What did the Heritage Hall tell you?" I told her what I'd read: the Concordat, the Keystone, the astronomical alignment, the original protocol. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What didn't you understand?" "Why a civilian?" I said. "Why someone without institutional backing? Why me?" "Because a diplomatic envoy or a military representative exists within a web of consequence," she said. "If something happens to them, an institution responds. Governments respond. There are formal protocols for missing persons in official capacities. A civilian, especially a civilian selected carefully, someone who lives alone, whose absence from Earth can be explained by a cover story already in place, leaves a smaller mark when they disappear." I felt the cold of the room more acutely. "Disappear," I said. "The binding is not lethal," she said carefully. "Not immediately, but it is not what you were told this visit would be. It changes the subject, biologically, cognitively. A human who undergoes resonant binding against their will, and without preparation does not die in any way that leaves evidence. They simply become different. And the version of you that returns to Earth will remember this trip fondly, will feel strongly that the consortium is humanity's most important ally, and will advocate effectively for outcomes that serve the consortium's interests in every conversation, every report, and every policy recommendation for the rest of their life." Silence. "A perfect ambassador," I said. "A perfect instrument," she said. I breathed. The ozone smell was sharp and too present. "Why are you telling me this?" I said. She paused. It was a different kind of pause than the ones I'd been getting from consortium personnel, not smooth, not performed. An actual pause, with something working behind it. "The Velkari have been part of this consortium for as long as the consortium has existed," she said. "We were asked to join not because we offered military strength or technological resources, but because we are historians. We document. We record. We do not build weapons, and we do not govern, and we do not produce goods. We watch, and we write down what we see, and we keep it, because eventually someone needs to know what actually happened rather than what was said to have happened." "And now you're telling me what's actually happening," I said. "I have spent 47 years in this archive," she said. "I have documented things I was not asked to document and kept records I was not asked to keep. I have done this because I believed it was the purpose of my function, even when my function was not designed to serve that belief." She looked at me steadily. "I have documentation of 17 previous instances of what is about to happen to you. 17 other individuals from non-member or pre-integration species who came to this station, were welcomed, were treated beautifully, and were bound without their knowledge or consent." "And none of them knew," I said. "One knew," she said. "A Kethel named Orvath. He figured it out on the day of the binding ceremony, which was presented to him as a celebratory cultural ritual. He refused to participate. He was managed. He returned to his homeworld with a story that satisfied everyone, and within 2 years, the Kethel had signed the full integration accord on terms that the consortium had written." "Managed," I said. Managed, she repeated and didn't elaborate. I sat down on the floor of the atmospheric processing sublevel because my legs were making a strong case for it. The floor was cold and slightly damp, and I sat on it anyway. "What's the alignment?" I said. "The astronomical one. When does it happen?" "Tomorrow," she said. "Evening, station time. They have scheduled a closing ceremony for your visit, a formal farewell with a ritual component that will be presented as a symbolic blessing." "Tomorrow," I said. "Yes." I stared at the floor for a moment, then I looked up. "What do you need from me?" She tilted her head slightly. The red ring in her eyes caught the dim light of the processing center. "I need you to not panic," she said. "I need you to behave through the entire day tomorrow exactly as you have been behaving. Grateful, impressed, cooperative. I need nothing in your face or your manner to suggest that this conversation happened. And then I need you to trust me during the ceremony," she said. "I will be present. When the moment comes, you will know it, because there will be a moment when they ask you to take something, or to stand in a specific place, or to perform some simple act that seems ceremonial. When that moment comes, do not do it. Just don't do it. And look at me." "That's the plan," I said. "It is the beginning of one," she said. "There are 400 beings in this station who have been extremely nice to me for 6 days and who want to use me as a living metaphysical battery," I said. "The plan is, don't do the thing and look at you." "Yes," she said. "Okay," I said. I stood up. "Can I ask you one more thing?" "You can ask," she said. "Why do you care?" I said. "You've been here 47 years. You've watched this happen 17 times. What's different about number 18? The pause this time was the longest yet. "Because you noticed," she said finally. "The other 17 didn't. They enjoyed the welcome and trusted the process and walked into the ceremony without a single doubt in their minds. You walked in with doubts on the first day. You sat in the Heritage Hall and read the small text." She looked at me, not with the reverence of the consortium, but with something that felt, across all the distance of species and origin, like recognition. "In 47 years, I have never seen anyone read the small text." I didn't know what to say. She walked away without a farewell, which I was beginning to understand was simply her manner, and I stood in the cold and the ozone until I was sure I could walk to my quarters with nothing on my face. The 7th day on Drelith Station was designed to be the best. I could see it in the choreography of it, the elevated quality of everything, the way the beings I encountered seemed to carry a subtle current of anticipation, like people at a party where the main event is imminent and the prior hours have been pleasant, but everyone knows the real thing is still coming. Coordinator Tail was warm. High Administrator Corval personally joined me for the midday meal and was charming in a way that I could feel was genuine while also not being all of what it appeared to be. I was given a gift, a longer piece than the metal disc from the reception, a kind of garment in the consortium style that had been adapted to human proportions. It was beautiful. I accepted it with what I hoped read as straightforward gratitude. I did not look for Sael. I did not think about the notebook in my quarters. I ate my food. I asked questions about the station's history that were just curious enough and just shallow enough. I watched the atrium lighting cycle through its colors. I was, for the first time in my life, the best performer in the room. The ceremony was at 1900 station time, in the Chamber of Concordance where I'd first been received. It was called, in translation, the Rite of Passage. The scheduling document Tail showed me described it as a traditional consortium blessing for new relationships, conducted at auspicious alignment periods. There was a note that it was rare for an integration candidate to be present for such an alignment. I dressed in the garment they'd given me. It fit. I couldn't decide if that was touching or chilling. The chamber was arranged differently than it had been for the reception. The beings were in concentric rings now, facing inward, facing the center of the room, where a raised circular platform about 3 meters across had been installed. In the center of the platform was a structure I can only describe as a lens, not made of glass, but of something that caught and redistributed the light in ways I couldn't track. A complex arrangement of elements that took the ambient light of the chamber and organized it into something purposeful. High Administrator Corval stood at the edge of the platform. Sael walked me to the base. "The ritual itself is simple," Sael said. "You will stand at the center of the platform. The administrator will speak the formal words. You will be asked to receive the mark, which is a small application of resonant compound to the palm of your hand. It is completely safe. Then the blessing is complete." "The palm of my hand," I said. "Yes," he said, "the receptor point." Receptor point. I looked across the room. The 400 beings in the concentric rings were present, and it was different now from the reception, quieter, more focused, with a quality to the attention that I could almost physically feel. Hundreds of beings from dozens of species, all facing inward, all focused on the center. The air felt heavier than before. I thought about what Sael had said, about the 17 before me, about the Kethel named Orvath who had understood too late, about the cover story already in place on Earth, about the version of me that would return to Ohio with a warm appreciation for the consortium and spend the rest of his life advocating for their interests while believing it was his own idea. I thought about Frank in the pickle, which I know sounds ridiculous, but that's what I thought about. Then I found her in the room. She was in the outermost ring, far from where I stood, far from the platform, unremarkable in her position, looking at the floor, or appearing to. When my eyes found her, she looked up. And I understood something in that moment that I don't have precise language for. It was the understanding that arrives sometimes between two people who are both paying close enough attention. Not words, not signals, just the shared certainty of a jointly held plan. I took a breath. I walked to the platform. I stood at the center. High Administrator Corval began to speak in the formal consortium language, and the translation module in my ear rendered it in English, ritual language, ancient construction, the kind of formal address that is designed to feel timeless. I stood with my hands at my sides and I listened, and I let my face hold the expression of a man who is moved and honored and grateful. The words came to the moment Sael had described. The moment when the administrator's speech shifted, when the resonant lens above me caught a new angle of light and something in the room changed, not visible, not audible, but present in the way a sound just beyond hearing is present, and Corval extended toward me a small vessel, open at the top, containing something that caught the light the way water does. "Receive the mark," he said. I looked at the vessel. I looked at my palm. I said, "I'd like to ask a question first." The room didn't make a sound, not even the ambient hum of breathing from 400 beings. It went completely still. Corval held the vessel. His expression was controlled. "Of course," he said, "speak." "I'd like to know what the mark does," I said. "I've read the Heritage Hall section on the Concordat of Necessary Sacrifice. I've read the secondary documentation notes at the Exhibit Cluster 9. I know what the resonant field is and how keystones function in it. I'd like someone to explain to me, before I extend my hand, what exactly I'm consenting to." The silence continued. It had a different quality now. Corval said, "The Heritage Hall exhibits are meant to provide historical context." "The secondary notes," I said, "describe the original protocol before consent was introduced as a revised measure. I'm not upset about that. I understand that the consortium has done things differently at different points in its history. But I'd like to know, clearly, what this ceremony will do to me, because I'm a civilian who came here in good faith and I'd like that faith to be respected. A specific quality of chaos that is distinct from confusion, a charged stillness. I heard a sound from the outer ring. A small sound, the quiet shift of someone moving in a space where movement has become significant. I didn't look toward it, but I registered it. Sael was doing something. Corval set the vessel down with a movement so controlled it was itself a kind of answer. He looked at me, not with the gracious warmth of the previous 7 days, but with something older and more complicated. "Elias Voss," he said. "You are the first candidate who has raised these questions." "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable," I said. "I'm asking for full disclosure before I participate in a ritual with biological and cognitive effects. That's not refusal, that's consent procedure." From the outer ring a voice, "High Administrator." Archivist Sael Vel Arenith walked through the concentric rings of 400 beings like she was taking a walk she had decided to take, unhurried, deliberate. And there was something in the way she moved that made the rings part for her without her asking them to. She came to stand beside the platform. She produced from somewhere in her garment a small data device that looked exactly as mundane as a tablet, and she held it up with one hand. "I have prepared a complete archival record of the Concordat's implementation over the past 2 centuries, she said. "I have transmitted copies to the Valkyrie Historical Commission, the independent observer network of the outer systems, and to 3 journalists embedded with the Free Press Bureau of Kethel Prime." She looked at Corval. "The copies are held in conditional release. If Elias Voss is permitted to leave this ceremony unchanged and is returned to his homeworld within 24 hours, the release does not trigger." The silence became the kind of silence that understands itself. Corval looked at Sael for a long moment. He looked at me. He looked at the vessel. He set the vessel on the edge of the platform with the same controlled grace he'd used for everything in the past 7 days, and he said, "Archivist Sael has raised procedural concerns that warrant review before the ceremony continues. The rite of passage is postponed pending consultation." It was the most elegant capitulation I have ever witnessed. The next several hours are complicated to explain because they were complicated to live through. There were meetings that I wasn't in. There were meetings that I was in, where people spoke in very formal language about procedural frameworks and archival protocols and integration agreements. Coordinator Tail looked like someone who had rehearsed for a play and arrived to find the theater had changed shape. At some point during the 3rd meeting, which was between me, Corval, 2 other senior consortium figures whose names I never fully captured, and Archivist Sael, who sat at the table with her hands folded and the patience of someone who has had 47 years to practice patience, Corval said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "We did not believe a human would be able to read the field. The resonance sensitivity required is generally unavailable to species below a certain biological threshold." "But I noticed something was off," I said. "Yes," he said, and he paused genuinely, not diplomatically. "You noticed, despite having no biological tools to detect it." "I'm a planner," I said. "I find gaps, it's what I do." He looked at me. For the first time since I'd arrived, the look wasn't managed. It was just a being looking at a thing they hadn't expected to exist. "We did not understand humans," he said. "Most people don't," I said. "It's a whole thing." I left Dralith Station 14 hours later than originally scheduled. I walked through the gunmetal door that appeared in my quarters and came out the other side into my hallway in Ohio, where everything was exactly as I'd left it. The cracked bumper, the deli on the corner, Frank, who added 2 pickles to my sandwich on Tuesday without being asked, because we'd arrived at that comfortable kind of familiarity. I had the metal disc. I had the garment I'd been given. I had my notebook, and I had a separate agreement, a formal document, drafted in the longest of the meetings and transmitted to the Valkyrie Historical Commission as an official record, that outlined new terms for humanity's integration relationship with the consortium. Full disclosure. No biological intervention without documented consent. No cover stories. No curated tour. An actual relationship. The lumpy, complicated, non-smooth kind. The kind that looks like real history. I also had something less formal. Before I left, not at the meeting, not in any official capacity, Sael had found me in the corridor outside my quarters. She handed me a small card, no larger than a business card, printed in both consortium script and English. It was an archival contact address. "For when you have questions," she said. "Will I have questions?" I said. "You read the small text," she said. "You will always have questions." I put the card in my jacket pocket, the fleece one, still the same fleece from the first day. "Why do you do it?" I said one last time. "Document things that no one asks you to document. Keep records that no one asks you to keep." She looked at me for a moment, and something in her face shifted. Not the assessment, not the watchfulness, but something more like the way a person looks when they're deciding to say the thing they actually mean. "Because history is just the record of what happened," she said. "And what happened depends entirely on who was watching and what they were willing to write down." She paused. "In 47 years, no one has thought that what I was doing was interesting enough to ask about." "It's interesting," I said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She walked away. Same walk as before, unhurried, deliberate, taking up exactly the space she meant to take up. No more, no less. I watched her go. Then I went home. The following is an addendum appended to this document by Archivist Sael or Reneth, in her capacity as compiling historian for this record. It is included with the full knowledge and consent of Elias Voss. I have been archiving the history of the Drelith Consortium for 47 years. In that time, I have documented conflicts and resolutions. I have recorded agreements that changed the lives of thousands and agreements that changed nothing except the documents themselves. I have watched species find each other, misunderstand each other, hurt each other, and occasionally, rarely, but it happens, genuinely recognize each other. I have documented 18 encounters between the consortium and new contact species representatives. Of the 17 that preceded this one, 16 resulted in completed bindings. One resulted in the managed outcome I described to Elias Voss in the processing sublevel. The 18th resulted in the Voss Accord. It is, to my knowledge, the first integration agreement in consortium history that was drafted under the condition that the non-member party had full awareness of everything they were agreeing to. It is the first agreement that includes in its preamble the phrase, "History must be accurate before it can be useful." High Administrator Corval has not formally acknowledged that the previous 17 encounters occurred. This is unsurprising. What is surprising, what I will admit was not fully anticipated even by me, is that he has not attempted to suppress this document. It sits in the archival record. It will be read by future archivists and future integration candidates, and eventually by beings who have not yet decided what the consortium should be. I have spent 47 years believing that the work of documentation is its own purpose, that writing a thing down accurately is enough, regardless of whether anyone reads it. I still believe this, but I am willing to admit that it is better when someone reads it. Elias Voss read the small text. He noticed the gap. He sat on the cold floor of an atmospheric processing sublevel at 200 station time and listened to a Velkari archivist with the patience of a man who has learned to trust the gap-finding instinct over the smooth official story. This is, I have concluded, a distinctly human quality. Not unique to humans, I do not deal in absolutes, but consistently present in a way that makes me curious about what else exists behind their ordinary exteriors. They are not a species with advanced technology. They do not have faster-than-light travel or biological field generation, or the kind of weaponry that makes consortium member species powerful in the conventional sense. They have, as far as I can determine, a water infrastructure planner from a place called Ohio who brought snacks for a 6-day interstellar diplomatic mission and noticed that something was off within the first 4 hours. I intend to visit. I have already written down what I expect to find. Real history in all its lumpy, contradictory, non-smooth texture. I cannot wait.